In Appalachia, fried pies are very popular and beyond common. Today I'm going to show you how to make them. You'll need some sort of filling. The most common filling used is apple. Most folks reconstitute dried apples with water and then add sugar and spices to taste and cook the apples down and use that as a filling. For the dough, you need 4 cups of self-rising flour. I prefer white lily. 3/4 cup shortening, 1/4 cup butter, 1 to 1.5 to 2 cups of ice water, additional flour for rolling out the dough, and your preference of oil to fry the pies in. I use vegetable oil. This recipe will make about 30 pies depending on the size you make them. Cut in the shortening until the flour is like coarse crumbs. Cut in the butter. It makes it easier if you cut the butter into small pieces first. As you can see, I didn't take the time to do that. This step is important because you want the added fat to be fully integrated with the flour. After I've cut the butter and shortening in, I use my hands to make sure it's all thoroughly mixed in. Add ice water a little at a time, using a fork to stir it in. Keep adding in water until the dough comes together. Then knead it a few times to make sure it's workable. Next comes the rolling out part. When Granny makes her pies, she pinches off a small lump of dough about the size of a walnut or golf ball and works with it. I usually roll out a larger piece of dough as though I'm going to cut out cookies, and instead I cut out pie shells. Either way works. Granny uses a small plate to judge the size of her pies. I use a small bowl as a guide to cut mine out. I complete this step before adding the filling. Sprinkling flour between the layers of pie shells keeps them from sticking. Add a small amount, about 1.5 tablespoons, of your filling in the center of your pie shell. Wet the edges with water before folding over and crimping the edges with a fork. Pies fry very quickly, so I go ahead and fill all my pie shells before I start frying them. Your oil needs to be about 1.25 inches deep in your pot. I prefer to use a cast iron pot, but use whatever you usually use to fry in. The oil needs to be 350 degrees. Carefully put the pies in a few at a time, depending on the size of the pot you're using. Keep a real close eye on the pies because they cook quickly. You'll only need to turn them once. You may need to add more oil and bring it to temperature as you fry the pies. Having a rack to put them on helps them stay crisp. As soon as the pies are removed from the oil, they can be dusted with sugar. I use a sugar and cinnamon mixture to sprinkle on mine. The pies are best when they're hot, but they're not bad when they're cold. So you just watched me make fried pies. Fried pies are one of those things when people talk about Appalachian Foodways that always come up. They're so good, and people have such fond memories of eating fried pies at their grandmother's or at the county fair, or just all kinds of different stories you'll hear about fried pies. Here's a little piece that John Paris wrote, Fried Dried Apple Pies, he calls it, and this is in his mountain cooking book. And I especially like this one because it's from Murphy, the story is. So it's from, Murphy is the county seat of the county I live in. So this was Aunt Tenny Clower that he was talking to. So he says, Aunt Tenny Clower, who is pushing 90, grew up on fried pies made from dried apples and shaped like half moons. They were all the go when I was coming on, she said. A sight more common than baked pies, folks labored and throve on them. Made them in the shape of a half moon and fried them in an iron skillet. Everybody called them half moon pies. When I was a child, folks had to dry everything, apples and peaches and pumpkins and beans. Just about everybody dried apples, and them that didn't could get dried fruit at the store. We had our own apple trees, and we dried our own apples. It was a side of apples we dried every year. There were 8 of us children, and it took a mighty lot to see us over the winter. There was hardly ever a meal that we didn't have fried pies. So you can see how, just from that little excerpt, how popular they were in days gone by, and still today you'll hear people talking about fried pies. But I have a really funny story about it. So I've showed you how to make fried pies. Now I'm going to show you the way Granny makes her fried pies, only they're not fried. So when I was growing up, Granny made these pies, just like the book says, called fried pies or half moon pies. Some people call them, I've even heard them called mule ears because they were in the shape of a mule's ear. People call them hand pies because you can hold them in your hand. Anyway, so Granny made them, and I grew up eating them, and I was so excited when Granny made fried pies. It was just wonderful. But it was only as an adult, now you're going to think this is really funny and that I'm really stupid, but it's only as an adult when the first time after I was married, I thought, well, I want to make some fried pies. And so I called Granny and she told me the recipe and I wrote it down, and then I thought, but they're not fried, they're baked. And so all that time, it's not that I didn't really know they were not fried, of course I did, we all did, but it was funny, Granny called them that because that was like fried pies, but she actually bakes hers, she doesn't fry them. So I was like, first thing I was like, well, wait a minute, Granny, I've never thought about it, but those pies you make, they're really good, but they're not fried. And she said, no, I don't fry mine. And I said, well, why not? And she said, well, when I was growing up, Aunt Kate could make the best fried pies of anybody. And I tried and I tried and I tried, and I could never get mine to do right. I always burned them, or either they didn't get done, and it just never worked. So I just started making them and baking them. But I guess I just kept calling them fried pies, even though they really weren't fried pies. Anyway, so that's just a funny story from Granny. But now I'm going to show you, so it is simpler. You've seen the process. Fried pies, they're easy, but it's time consuming because it takes a while to make the dough and then to spread it out, to roll it out, to put the filling in, and then to actually fry them. That is kind of a tricky part. You have to make sure your oil's hot enough, and it's just like a learned thing. The more you do it, just like any other type of cooking, the better you'll get at it. And there's fried pies is like everything else, whether it's cornbread or biscuits or whatever. There's as many different recipes and variations. If you do a search for it, you'll find all kinds of different directions and different recipes for the actual dough and the apples and the filling, different fillings. Like the John Paris, the lady that he was talking to, the most common one is dried apples. So they take dried apples and then they reconstitute them and they cook them down and add the sugar and the spices they want, and that's the filling. I've done that before. I dry apples every year, but for me, I make apple preserves, and it's way easier for me. I just use those. I just use those as the filling, and they turn out good. Sometimes I use apple butter for the filling, and they turn out good. So although I made fried apple pies today for you, to show you how to do it. Most of the time I make them the way Granny does, just because it's so much faster. Typically I just use biscuit dough. The biscuit recipe that I use is I use self-rising white lily flour and whipping cream mixed together to make my biscuits. They're really good, and most of the time I'll just use that dough and then I'll roll them out, put my filling in, and bake them in the oven like Granny does. So today I'm going to show you. So this is some of the dough actually that I used for the fried pies, so I'm going to use it instead today. And you can use any sort of dough. And there's a lot of people you'll see that use canned biscuits, or maybe like the pie shells, rolled pie shells that you can buy in the freezer section of your grocery store, or the refrigerated section. People use those. So you would just roll your dough out just like you would for the ones that you were going to fry. And you can make large pies or you can make them smaller. That's just up to you. It's just personal preference. I have this, I guess it would be the size of maybe a salad bowl. It's like a little storage bowl. I like to use it to cut mine out, but sometimes I don't use anything on it. And I'm really big on it's the way food tastes, not how it looks. So if mine looks a little wonky and they're not all perfect, it doesn't bother me. I just worry about how it tastes. So then you'd put the filling in, and you can use some water to crimp the edges, like we did with the fried pies, and then use your fork to get the edges. And you can poke some holes if you're baking them. You can poke a few holes in the top of them, and that lets the steam out just like you would for a pie. And then you put it on a greased cookie sheet, and then you're ready to bake them at 450 or between 400 and 450 degrees. I usually go about 425, and it usually takes about 20 minutes. Okay, so here's an example. You can see this is the baked one that I just baked, the way Granny bakes hers, and this is the fried one. So then if you break them open, you can see Granny's is more like a biscuit dough or something, because it's not been fried. It's not as flaky. And it makes a little hollowed out place. You can see the steam coming out. Then the fried one, it has more, just as you would think, has the more of a flakier crust that'll come off. So that's the difference in them. Both are really good though. I hope you enjoyed learning how to make fried pies today and how to make unfried pies today. Leave me a comment and tell me what your favorite filling is. Apple is certainly the most common and the most traditional when it comes to fried pies, but people also use a lemon filling. They use bananas. I've heard people using a banana filling. I use peach jam sometimes, and that's especially good. And then people use chocolate for their filling in their fried pies. Whippoorwill Hollow, if you've never visited her channel, you should. And she has a great video showing how to make fried pies, but she shows how to make that great chocolate filling. I've never made it. I need to try that, so I hope that you'll go check her out. But mostly, I just hope you'll drop back by often as I celebrate Appalachia.